Hello, I'm Remington. Welcome. So, there's a new shelf. Well, two new shelves actually. I'm not going to talk about it much because, the last video was me reorganizing, but I wasn't quite happy with it, so I changed things up a little bit. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Red Rising. So, let's do that. So, to start out, for anyone who doesn't know what Red Rising is, although I don't know how you would find this video without knowing what that is, it's basically a sci-fi dystopian space opera. It slowly develops into a space opera. Don't go into the first book expecting that or you'll be disappointed. I like to sum it up basically saying if the Hunger Games and Ender's Game had a baby, that would be Red Rising. If that is at all an intriguing premise to you, just go pick up the first book. You're probably going to love it. And if you are an audiobook listener, I would highly recommend the graphic audiobook versions. They're a little bit expensive because they're split into two parts. So like you're paying for two books, but you're only getting two halves of one book. But it's a full cast production. There's music. The acting is fantastic. I would very highly recommend it if you're an audiobook listener. But anyway, that's enough for the people who don't know why they're here. For the people who do, let's start talking about book one. So book one starts out pretty slowly, but lovely, honestly. It takes about 100 pages to really get the plot going. And I think that is for the series, or the trilogy at least, the trilogy's benefit, because it takes its time setting up all of Darrow's motivation, because we see him in Lycos, we see his family, we see him working in the mines, and most importantly we see Io. He drives everything, or she drives everything about Darrow. She is his entire motivation. He works harder in the mines just to try to get her more food, even if that is ultimately a vain goal. And that drives him throughout the entire trilogy. I do expect this to change in Iron Gold, with Mustang being his partner. I'm assuming they're gonna get married, and then their son as well. I don't know what role Io is gonna play, if any. That's gonna be something that's interesting to see because I haven't read those books yet. But yeah, Pierce really just takes his time there. We see Darrow as a strong-willed young, garish, brainless kind of guy, or not brainless, but he's a 16-year-old boy. He does 16-year-old boy things, and he does everything that he does for Io. He pushes himself to the brink in the mines just to try and get her more food. Darrow so often makes decisions for Io and his family in Lycos. His new friends are important to him, but as we see at the beginning of Morningstar, he's willing to do what it takes to get the job done, to free his people. It's a little strange thinking back to Darrow pre-carving. So much naivety and childishness was lost in the process. And of course, some of that is due to the physical transformation as well as the mental. Darrow, if I recall, was essentially uneducated before Quicksilver's husband, whatever his name was, tutored him. And obviously, Io's death would play a huge part in, losing your wife at such a young age. That's gotta change a guy. As well as learning that everything that you and your family has ever worked for and ever believed is a complete lie. You cannot be the same person after that. Seeing Darrow grow into a leader, in a commander of an army, is honestly one of the highlights of the trilogy. Then there's the whole Julian ordeal. Julian deserves so much better, which is a sentiment that I have for so many characters in the series. But he was such a gentle soul. I really think that this is the first clue that Pierce Brown was not going to be pulling any punches. And yeah, he definitely doesn't. It's a brutal series to get through. Obviously Cassius was eventually going to find out about Julian's death, and I was worried that it was going to be a little disappointing, and I was right a little bit. Basically Lilith just gives him a hollow cube, and then he watches that and finds out. It feels like a little bit of just a thing to drive the plot along, but I do get it, and it does connect nicely to the overarching plot against Darrow from the Proctors. I do also think that it's kind of interesting how much influence Augustus had over the war games. And then in the next book, he's essentially powerless. Like, I get that he bribed a whole bunch of people, but like, why isn't anyone else bribing people if that's just a thing that can happen so easily? But the tribal warfare, hands down, was the best part of the first book. You know, it gave me the same kind of primal, masculine feeling that watching Braveheart does, you know, especially at the end of the movie when William Wallace shouts freedom. You know, I have to imagine that that's the same kind of feeling that like a sports fan gets when they watch a good game. The battles and the tactics were wonderful. They're definitely a strong point of Pierce Brown's, although I do have to kind of knock it a little bit for the repetitive nature of basically the gang finding themselves in some insurmountable bind. Just for Darrow to actually have had a plan all along, that's honestly a problem throughout all three of the books. You know, it gets really gimmicky really quickly, and it hurts the stakes because, you know, like, nothing too serious is going to happen. I don't have too much to say on this point, but the whole Tactus whipping scene was ridiculous, and I ate it up. You know, I'm kind of a sucker for like motivational unifying speeches. You know, I'm a big fan of Ned Stark. Red Rising does definitely feel a little bit more YA than the other two books in the series. There are, of course, some pretty mature themes in the first book, but there's a overall certain lack of maturity, I guess. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. You know, the tonal shift between Red Rising and Golden Sun, is pretty stark. A problem that is mostly unique to the first book is its sexist portrayal of women. You know, I didn't notice this at first, to be perfectly honest with you, but after I read it and I was reading some reviews, I had it pointed out to me that, you know, carving exists and physical enhancements in this world are commonplace, especially for gold, so why wouldn't women benefit from them just as much as men do? You know, so often in the first book, the women just kind of feel like plot devices. We see Theodora and Aja in the other books, as well as Mustang, who's a great character, although I do think that she is underutilized in general. For the most part, I think that Pierce Brown responded to this criticism pretty well. The Jackal was honestly kind of an underwhelming character in this book, and a little bit in the series overall. His introduction and escape were really cool. Rest in peace, Pax Au Telemanus, forever in our hearts. You deserved so much better than you got. You know, one of my favorite parts of the graphic audiobooks that I mentioned earlier is actually in some of the fight scenes, Pax is just shouting his name over and over again. That is such a wonderful thing, and I loved it so much. But going back to the Jackal, overall, I feel like he's kind of undercooked as a character. Like, he could have used a few more background scenes to really strengthen him as a character, especially for how important he is to the overall trilogy. Like, he plays a huge role, but we don't really see all that much of him. And the ending with Mustang going to join forces with her brother was ridiculous. It was a nothing burger. You know, nothing was going to happen from that. That was so obvious, and it just felt like it was, you know, ramping up the stakes one last time for the sake of ramping up the stakes. And I did not like that at all. There's nothing worse than stakes for the sake of stakes. You know, I didn't pay any attention to Severo at the start of the book. You know, he just kind of went off and did his own thing, and I forgot about him. Later, when Darrow and Cassius reconnect with him, you know, it's pretty obvious that he's going to be a pretty important character overall, and he ends up being one of the best. You know, I know that he's a lot of people's favorites, and that's for pretty good reason. You know, he's loyal, he's cunning, and he's got a sort of like cultishness quality to him, especially in how he commands the Howlers, which is just lovely to watch or listen to or read. And he only gets better as a character as the trilogy goes on. I don't have too much to say about Cassius in the first book, just that I do really respect him as a principled man. You know, he's devoted to his family and to duty, and he's going to do whatever it takes. And Mustang saving Darrow in this book is straight out of Hunger Games, where Katniss is saving Peeta. You cannot tell me that that was not the direct inspiration for that scene. But overall, Red Rising was such a solid book. I loved it so much when I read it. I think I gave it 5 stars, which, looking back on it, I don't think it quite deserves that. Definitely 4, maybe even 4.5, but 5 I think was just a little bit too much. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Red Rising. Let's talk about stay. Let's talk about Golden Sun. So after coming off of Red Rising, I was super excited for Golden Sun. You know, I hadn't had such a narcotic kind of reading experience since I had read Misery by Stephen King last year. And the gap between the first and second book was jarring. I didn't expect to go straight into Darrow basically being kicked out of the family because he failed the Institute. I would have really liked to see everything that happened in the gap between the books, but I guess I do understand starting it off in this way so we can just start establishing stakes right off the bat. Harmony's appearance in this book made me sad, and Mickey's made me even sadder. I knew that something had to be up. There's no way that the Resistance goes from being able to produce fake golds like Darrow in that way to basically having to resort to suicide bombings. Like, something major had to have happened. And I think that Darrow's willingness overall to bomb the dinner party really goes to show just how hopeless he is at this point and how much he doesn't believe in his own abilities anymore. He's ostracized Mustang at this point, which is another thing that I wish we would have been able to see firsthand. He's ultimately still dedicated to the cause of his people. He's just disillusioned at this point and doesn't have any confidence in his own ability. He failed, and even if Roque buys out his contract to protect him from the Bolognas, what is he supposed to do? I really do understand why bombing the dinner party would make sense as the most impactful thing that he could do, even if that meant that immediately after that he got caught. His decision to drug Roque was, wow. Like, what a horrible but ultimately necessary decision to make. And I didn't expect this to create nearly as much of a divide between the two as it did. I expected Roque to be the first one that Darrow really let in and let him see his true self. And I was disappointed that that didn't happen. On a better note, Darrow's quick thinking when he comes up of the plot to basically start a blood feud and a galactic war, that was amazing to see. And the resulting fight scene between Cassius and Darrow was so engrossing. It was fantastic. I will say that it would have been nice to know a little bit more about Lorne and maybe even see, Darrow training with him a little bit before we just drop that bomb as if like it's this huge thing that we should know about. Like, I don't know. It would have been nice to see that. It's kind of just another one of those secrets that Darrow keeps with us just to artificially inflate the stakes. So Ragnar in this book is an acceptable replacement for Pax. He's not as good as Pax, of course. Pax Autelmanis, forever in our hearts. You deserve so much better than you got. But I do like Ragnar. He's a great character. I liked him a lot, particularly the moral and social questions that Darrow wrestled with because of that. Like, how much could he trust him to do his own thing, and how much pushback would he receive from the Golds for letting him do his own thing? Speaking of the Golds, the Telemanuses are fantastic characters. I love them so much. Like I said earlier, I have a huge soft spot for fatherly figures like Ned Stark or Benjamin Martin. I love that the Telemanuses are always on Darrow's side, although it does feel a little weird how easily they are won over. I'm glad that they're on Darrow's side, obviously, but it just feels like a little bit more pushback would have made sense for how ingrained in Gold society they were. Tactus's death was a legitimate tragedy. It really made me sad. I wanted redemption to be a bigger part of the story. I can't say that Lorne was wrong for killing Tactus, because obviously he wasn't, but I really wanted to see Tactus come back. I'm a big believer in second chances. Obviously Tactus could never have the same role that he had before, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't redeem himself. He couldn't come back and be on the right side. And Darrow knew that it was going to cause so many problems if he did bring him back, but I really did want it. I want to believe that there's good in people, and seeing that get stripped away from somebody like that when they're at their lowest, that was tough. Lorne, like I said, it would have been nice to have more of a introduction to him, but I do really like him as a character and like as a fatherly figure for Darrow in general, even if sometimes he does kind of give some like boomer energy. He shares the same kind of mental space for me as Sir Baratheon from Game of Thrones. I could cut down all of you right now, even at my age, that kind of stuff. I would have really liked to see Lorne's reaction to who Darrow really was. I think that would have been absolutely fascinating to see. The old man who is so entrenched, even so much more than the Telemanuses are in, Gold culture, and how he would have wrestled with that and what he would have done. That's not really a perspective that we really get to see from anyone who isn't overtly on Darrow's side. Like, there's a couple of the Howlers that, ultimately leave because of that. Everyone else that we see that from is just strictly against Darrow. The best part of Golden Sun by far was learning who Ares was. That was such a good chapter that I read it twice. I specifically remember thinking that we had to have met Ares by now. Like, there's no way that such an important character is just some rando. I remember thinking, like, it's possible it could be Quicksilver because he was kind of foreshadowed and we haven't met him yet. But then as soon as it was revealed to be Fitchner, it was like, oh, duh. Of course it was Fitchner. It had to be Fitchner all along. It's such a good scene when he finally tells Darrow that he's Ares. I do wish that he had continued to be a bigger part of the series, you know. He just kind of goes off and does his own thing and then dies, you know, which was disappointing. I do feel like I should have something to say about Mustang at this point. You know, she's obviously a super intelligent character. We see that in the War Room meeting. But other than that, she's not much more of like a motivator and a driving force for Darrow in this book. Aja, on the other hand, is a super cool villain. I really like her. I particularly love hating her. And of course, I couldn't talk about Golden Sun without mentioning the Red Wedding. This was such a brutal scene. You know, obviously you can't have the middle book in a trilogy end on a high note, which it felt like it was going to. I knew it wasn't, but like I felt that build up. And I genuinely believe that Pierce Brown got off writing that ending, knowing how much it was going to affect people. You know, I understand Roke's jadedness with Darrow in general. But I didn't think that he was going to go as far as he did. I expected him to leave, but I didn't expect him to outright betray Darrow in this way. It also seems just a little bit strange to me how Roke left his friends to basically join the side that's killing his friends and is responsible for what he's upset about. But overall, Golden Sun is just such a huge improvement from the first book. You know, going from tribal warfare to a solar system spanning war is just fantastic. The stakes are so much higher, even though sometimes they are artificially inflated. Golden Sun builds on the foundation of Red Rising so beautifully, and it really paves the way for Morningstar to be an absolutely epic book, which I don't think it quite met that, but you know, we'll talk about that now. So I did take a slight break between Golden Sun and Morningstar just because, as much as I love the way that these books make me feel, it is pretty intense and you can't just keep going from book to book. You know, it gets to be a little much. So I read The Stranger between them. When I came back, my expectations were super high. You know, I'd heard that each book just gets better and better. You know, and I saw the progression from Red Rising to Golden Sun. So, you know, I expected a similar rise with Morningstar, which the start of the book honestly does deliver on that, though. You know, the breakout scene is so incredible. I instantly loved Holiday and her brother, whatever his name was. Sorry, bro, you deserve better than you got. The whole thing, like, as awesome as it was, it is kind of out there, though, that the only significant character who died was Holiday's brother. And seeing Cassius and Aja again was pretty cool, and also the effects that the isolation and torture had on Darrow, and like how he couldn't even trust people specifically sent there to save him. That was wild. And then seeing the resistance in the civilians in the mines was honestly fascinating. I love seeing details of what war and revolution looks like for common people. I honestly wish that the book had leaned into this a lot more, although I understand why it isn't, because it is like borderline YA, and also it had so much else going on. I do really hope to see more of that in Iron Gold, though. It does kind of slow down for a bit after this. You know, the first 70 pages or so were straight fire, and then the next 30, I don't exactly remember what happens in the next 30, but I remember it being kind of disappointing. But it didn't take too long for it to pick back up with the Quicksilver heist, and I do love a good heist. Several really turned into a turd with Darrow gone. Like, I get it, his father got whacked, his best friend gets captured and then publicly executed, and he's got a revolution to run, and honestly he's at every disadvantage. I don't blame the guy for kind of losing it. Honestly, the fact that he didn't lose it more is pretty astounding. And it was really nice to see the boys kiss and make up. Quicksilver honestly did feel like a little bit of a cop-out. Like, him being on their side, okay, that's one thing. But him being one of the founding members, that felt a little much. But going back to the heist for a minute, it doesn't really make sense to me why Darrow didn't say anything to Mustang. You know, before the fighting broke out, if he had just said something to her, like, there's a good chance that a lot of that could have been avoided. Like, obviously Aja still would have done something, but I don't know, it felt very strange that he didn't even try to talk to her at all. In this book, I feel like Mustang is so much more of just an idea for Darrow than an actual character. The ice planet and the freeing of the obsidians was really cool. I love the whole fake god thing. I think that was done really well. It's super interesting to me, especially that they put so much effort into it. Like, it's terrible, obviously, but like it's fascinating. You know, Ragnar's death honestly caught me off guard. You know, I expected him and Roke to both be alive at the end of the book. I liked Ragnar a lot by this point, and I was sad to see him go. You know, he deserved better. And his sister is an okay replacement. I feel like we're getting worse with each subsequent replacement. Like, Pax, amazing. Ragnar, very solid. Then, I don't remember his sister's name, but she was okay. I don't understand why Roke made the decisions that he made. Like, again, I understand his jadedness with Darrow, but just switching sides to kill more of your friends, you know, even if you weren't as close with anyone else, like, it still just feels very strange for someone who is so loving and like upright as a person. You know, he was kind of like Julian in the way that he was just righteous, you know. Yeah, maybe he wasn't nearly as close with anyone else, but to completely betray them is just wild. I really think that something must have broke inside of him. You know, he doesn't seem to care about anything aside from gaining prestige and revenge against Darrow. He's really just a shell of his former self, and I wanted to see him come back and be redeemed, but you know, that's not something that we got to see. I'm going to talk about Cassius' redemption now before I talk about the last 100 pages of the book. And this is pretty much what I wanted both for Tactus and Roke. You know, Cassius is obviously such a noble person. We see this throughout the entirety of the book. Every time he appears, you know, he's doing something, even though he's on the bad side, you know, he's still being honorable. He's still being a man of principle. You know, Pierce Brown obviously wants us to sympathize with him. We know that he's a good person, and really the only thing keeping him apart from Darrow is the blood feud, you know, the fact that he killed Julian and the duty that he has to his family. You know, it's pretty clear that Cassius is going to join Darrow with all the foreshadowing going on, which honestly just makes the fake twist near the end just all the worse, in my opinion. But we'll get there in a second. Uncle Neril, honestly, he meant nothing to me. You know, when he came back, I felt nothing. I had completely forgotten that he was a character. I also think that the color uprising that happened because of it was kind of ridiculous in the way that it was written. You know, I get that there would be a lot of animosity between the colors, and maybe something like this could have and should have happened, but not like this. It basically came out of nowhere and just felt like another twist for the sake of a twist. And nothing changes because of it. You know, it's done and gone with just as quickly as it started. If it was foreshadowed a bit more and had a larger plot effect in general, then I think that it would have made a really good scene. But it wasn't, so it didn't. So after this, I was feeling a bit jaded. You know, I was willing to forgive it because, you know, overall Morningstar had been a pretty solid book. It hadn't quite met my expectations. But overall, it was good, and I was enjoying it. But the fake twist at the end of the book is really what just ruined it for me. Like, I get that Antonia needed to be on the same page as Cassius in order for them to really trust Cassius, but I really don't think that they needed to actually go as far as fake killing Severo and letting us believe that he was dead. It was all just for the sake of a twist to add stakes, and there's nothing more than I hate than fake stakes. Pierce had held information from us before. That's not necessarily the problem, although it did get kind of annoying at points. This was just too much. Like, Darrow is narrating as if Severo actually died and everything is ruined. Like, obviously we know that that's not the case and that's not what's happening, but you know, it really feels like the characters genuinely believe what's going on. Like, they're not in on it either, and that just makes everything feel fake. Like, so much could have gone wrong with this plan too. Like, at any point they could have separated Darrow and Mustang. They could have done whatever they wanted with Severo's body. Like, why are they dragging a dead body along with two war criminals? Like, what kind of sense does that make? And then also letting the two biggest war criminals in the solar system in the same room that, like, all of your higher-ups are in your war room as a planet is being invaded. What kind of sense does that make? What are you doing? I was so done after reading that scene that, like, it basically ruined the entire book for me. And the ending, which was nice and should have been really enjoyable, I didn't care. I didn't care about any of that anymore because the entire book had been spoiled. You know, honestly, I thought that I was done with Red Rising. and Pierce Brown in general. Like, I have the next 2 books, and I was looking forward to reading them before I finished this, and then after that, like, honestly, I thought about giving them away. Like, that's how mad I was in that moment. But I walked away, and I let it simmer for a while, and I don't feel any differently about Morningstar. But overall, it hasn't ruined the first 2 for me nearly as much as I thought it was going to. And from what I've heard, Pierce Brown does handle the narration differently in the next books, so hopefully things like this won't be as much of an issue. But yeah, that's all I have to say about Morningstar. I'd be very curious to know if you relate to how I felt reading Morningstar at all. Like, I've talked to a couple people about it, and I had some sentiments for my feelings, but for the most part, it doesn't seem like people cared about that nearly as much as I did. So I'd be curious to see what you have to say. Also, I am kind of thinking about doing another Red Rising video about looking at the lore and the politics of Red Rising, like looking at how the power systems and the governments developed throughout the timeline and relating that back to like real life historical events and governments. So if that's something that you'd like to see, let me know. And I'm working on it right now, but it's probably going to be quite a while before I actually do it, because that's something that I'm putting a little bit more effort in than most of the other videos that I do here. So anyway, that's all I have to say. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.